Elam Pruitt had not chosen his own tie in 4 years. He did not know this yet. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror on a Tuesday morning in October, knotting a burgundy silk tie around his collar, convinced he had picked it himself. He even had a vague memory of reaching into the closet and pulling it from the rack. But if anyone had asked him to describe the moment, really describe it, the memory would dissolve like fog under sunlight, because it was not a memory. It was something his wife had placed inside his mind, soft and seamless, the way you press a stone into wet clay. His wife's name was Tegan. She was still asleep when he left for work, or she appeared to be. One arm draped over the pillow, dark locks fanned out around her head, lips slightly parted. She looked peaceful. She looked like the woman he had married 8 years ago, the one who sang worship songs while she cooked, Sunday breakfast, and cried every time the choir sang Total Praise. She was still that woman in certain lights, but she had also become something else. And Elam, God-fearing, church-going, Bible-carrying Elam Pruitt had no idea. Their life looked extraordinary from the outside. Elam was the senior pastor of Cornerstone Harvest Church, a congregation of nearly 1,200 members in a mid-sized Georgia city. He had planted it 12 years ago with 37 people and a rented space above a laundromat. Now they had a proper building, a growing outreach ministry, a radio broadcast, and a waiting list for membership classes. Tegan stood beside him through all of it, faithful, present, sharp. She organized every leadership retreat, mentored the women's ministry, hosted pastors' wives from across the state in her home. She was elegant and warm, and everyone trusted her. She was also the reason the church was not growing the way it should have been. This was the thing no one could see. Not Elam, not his armor-bearer Matthias, not his childhood friend and associate pastor Ambrose, not even Elam's mother, who had always had discernment sharper than a surgical blade. Numbers had stalled at 1,200 for 3 years. Staff members who showed too much promise would suddenly resign. A youth revival that should have drawn hundreds was rained out in a way that meteorologists later described as statistically improbable. A generous donor who had pledged 6 figures to the building fund died suddenly before signing the paperwork, and the pledge died with him. Elam prayed about each of these things. He fasted, he sought counsel, he blamed spiritual warfare in a general sense, the way pastors sometimes do when they cannot locate the source of the battle. He did not know the battle was sleeping in his bed. The first sign came through a woman named Landry. Landry worked as a nurse and had been a member of Cornerstone Harvest for 5 years. She was not dramatic or excitable. She was the kind of woman who took notes during sermons and cross-referenced them during the week. Serious, grounded, not given to visions or impressions, which is why what happened to her in early November shook her so deeply. She had been fasting for 3 days. Personal reasons, a health decision she needed. God's direction. When she walked past the church office on a Wednesday evening and saw Tegan coming out of the parking garage alone. This was not unusual. What was unusual was what Landry felt in her chest when she saw her. Not fear exactly. Not dislike. Something older and deeper than both. A warning in her spirit so strong her feet stopped moving, without her deciding to stop them. She stood there on the sidewalk while Tegan walked to her car, got in and drove away. Landry went home and wrote in her prayer journal, "Something is wrong around the pastor. Lord, show me what to do with this." She did not go to Elam. She barely trusted the impression herself. But she began to pray. In December, Elam got sick. Not dramatically sick. Nothing that would alarm anyone. He just became slow, heavy in a way that sleep did not fix. He would sit down to study scripture, and within 10 minutes his thoughts would blur. He would stand to preach and feel fine. But the moment he sat back down in his chair, the exhaustion would return like a tide. His doctor ran tests. Everything came back normal. "You're a busy man," the doctor said. "You're probably just carrying too much." Elam nodded and went home and told Tegan what the doctor said. She listened carefully, and then brought him ginger tea and rubbed the back of his neck until he fell asleep on the couch. Her hands were warm. He trusted those hands completely. What he did not know was that the tea had something in it. Not poison. Nothing that any lab test would catch. Something older. Something ground from a root that Tegan kept in a cloth pouch at the back of her closet shelf behind her winter sweaters. A pouch that had been given to her by an elderly woman she visited once a month in a part of town that she told Elam was her community outreach route. It was not a community outreach route. How it started is important, because Tegan had not always been this woman. She had been a genuinely devoted Christian for years before everything shifted. She had loved God. She had loved Elam. She had wanted nothing but his success in the growth of the church and a good life for their family. The shift began 6 years ago with fear. Elam had been approached by a larger church about merging, a church that had far more resources, but would have required him to step into a subordinate role for a transitional period. He was considering it seriously. He had prayed and fasted and told Tegan he believed God was in it. Tegan had been terrified, not of the merger, of what came after, of losing the position she had built, the influence she held, the identity she had constructed over years as the founder's wife of a growing church. If Elam became a subordinate, she would become nothing. She had poured herself into this role. She had sacrificed for it. She could not let it collapse. She had prayed about it. She had asked God to change Elam's mind. But the impression she kept getting in prayer was, trust me. She did not want to trust. She wanted results. She wanted certainty. And that is when she went looking for another kind of help. The elderly woman's name was Tierney. She was small and light-boned, with quick gray eyes and a way of listening that made you feel she was reading, something written on the inside of your skin. She lived in a house that smelled of earth and candle wax, and she called herself a root worker and told Tegan that she was a Christian woman too, that what she did was just old healing knowledge. Nothing evil, nothing dark. Tegan should have left. She did not leave. She told herself it was just one time, just a small thing, something to help Elam see clearly. The merger fell apart 3 weeks later for reasons entirely unrelated to anything Tegan had done. But Tierney told her she was the reason, and something in Tegan chose to believe it. 1 time became 2 times, 2 became a pattern became a dependency. And slowly, the woman who had once lifted her hands in worship and meant every word became a woman who wore worship as a costume while she fed her husband confusion, root in his evening tea, and kept a specific candle burning in a jar in the basement every time there was a major church decision. She told herself she loved him. She told herself she was protecting him. She told herself God understood. The prayer meeting that changed everything happened on a Thursday night in January. It was not scheduled. Elam's armor-bearer, Matthias, had called a small group, together, maybe 14 people, because he had been disturbed in his spirit for weeks and did not know what else to do. Matthias was 26 years old and had been serving Elam for 3 years. He was quiet and faithful, not given to grand gestures. But he had been waking at 3 in the morning, with a single phrase pressing against his chest like a hand. Someone is working against the house. He had not told Elam. He did not know how to say it without sounding accusatory or unstable. So instead he called a prayer meeting. He invited intercessors from the church. Landry was among them, and a few trusted leaders. They did not use a program or a format. They just prayed. For the first 40 minutes, the prayers were general. For the church, for the community, for the nation. Normal, decent, earnest prayer. Then Landry began to weep, not softly, deeply, from somewhere below her sternum. She wept, and then she began to pray in the Spirit. And the room shifted in a way everyone present would describe later. With the same word, heavy. Not heavy in a bad way. Heavy in the way that a doctor becomes focused when they have found what they were looking for. A concentrated, purposeful weight. One of the older intercessors, a quiet woman named Bellamy, who almost never raised her voice, stood up and pointed to nothing in particular and said, in a low and certain voice, "The attack is close. It is not far off. It is inside the house." The room went still. Matthias felt the hairs on his arms rise. Nobody said another word for almost 60 seconds. Then they prayed again, harder and more specifically, though none of them could have explained exactly what they were praying toward. They were praying the way you dig when you know something is buried. Elam was not at the prayer meeting. He was home. He fell asleep early, which had been happening often, and woke at 2:17 in the morning with a dream, still wrapped around him like a wet cloth. In the dream, he had been standing in his church, preaching to a full house, but every word that came out of his mouth floated away before it reached the congregation. The words were real and true, but they were being captured by something just above the first row of seats, caught and dissolved, like salt thrown into water. He sat up in bed. His heart was not racing, which surprised him. Instead, he felt clear, alert in a way he had not felt in months. Tegan was asleep beside him. He got up quietly, went to his study, and opened his Bible. He sat there in the lamplight for a moment, not reading, just breathing, and then a thought entered his mind so suddenly it startled him. You have not prayed for your home. Not a condemnation, not an accusation, a plain observation, like someone pointing out that a window had been left open. Elam thought about it. He prayed at church. He prayed in staff meetings. He prayed before sermons and over hospital beds and at the gravesides of church members. He prayed in restaurants before meals and in his car on the way to appointments. But when had he last gotten on his knees in his own home and prayed over every room? He could not remember. He got up from his chair. He started in the study. He laid his hand on his desk and his bookshelves and his filing cabinet, and he prayed over every piece of furniture, every drawer, every book. He moved into the hallway. He prayed over the photographs on the walls, the children they had not yet been able to have, the years represented in those frames. He went into the kitchen. He prayed over the table, and the refrigerator and the stovetop, and the cups in the cabinet. He went into the living room and the guest bathroom and the small room they used for storage. Then he stood outside the door to his bedroom. He could hear Tegan breathing inside. He pushed the door open softly and stepped in. He prayed over the nightstands and the dresser and the window. He prayed over Tegan as she slept, standing at the foot of the bed with his hand extended toward her, praying quietly for her protection and her heart and her peace. Then he opened her closet to pray over it. He was not looking for anything. He was not suspicious. He was simply doing what he had started. He laid his hand on the closet doorframe and prayed. And then, because the light was bad, he reached up and pulled the cord for the overhead bulb, and the closet flooded with light. And his eyes went automatically to the shelf where her sweaters were folded. One of the sweaters had shifted. Maybe it had been disturbed when she got something out before bed. And behind it he could see something dark. A cloth, brown and tied with string. He would not have thought anything of it if not for what happened in his chest when he saw it. The closest word for what he felt was recognition. Not surprise, recognition, as if something in his spirit already knew. He reached up slowly and moved the sweater aside. The pouch was small, about the size of a fist, and when he picked it up, it was heavier than it looked. There was also, pushed behind it, a small glass jar with a dark residue along the bottom. He did not know what it was. He did not need to know. He stood there in his wife's closet at 2:40 in the morning, holding a thing he did not have a category for, and the grief that moved through him was so large it nearly took his legs out from under him. He sat down on the floor of the closet. He sat there for a long time. He did not go through the stages of anger and denial. He went straight to grief, because somewhere, in the deepest part of him, the part that had been feeling slow and heavy and clouded, for months, that part already knew, and the knowing, finally arriving in full, was not a revelation. It was a collapse. He wept without sound, so he would not wake her. Then he prayed, not a structured prayer, not a pastoral prayer, the oldest kind of prayer, the kind that is barely words at all, just a man broken open before God, handing over something too large for him to carry. Lord, I don't know what this is. I don't know how long. I don't know how to feel about any of this. But I am not letting go of you. Whatever this is, I am not letting go. He stayed on that floor until the first gray light came through the bedroom window. He did not confront Tegan that morning. He put the pouch back where he found it, moved the sweater back into place, turned off the closet light, and went to make coffee. When Tegan woke up and came into the kitchen, he looked at her the way he always did and asked how she slept. Good, she said. You were up early. Couldn't sleep, he said. She poured her coffee and sat across from him at the table, and he watched her face while she scrolled through her phone, and he thought, I have loved you for 15 years. I have trusted you with everything. And underneath that thought, quieter and more devastating, how did I not see it? He was not angry yet. He knew the anger would come. But in that moment he was doing something more important than processing his own emotions. He was watching and praying, and he was asking God, without knowing the words for it, for wisdom that was greater than his own. He called Ambrose that afternoon. Ambrose was the one person in his life he had told everything to. They had grown up in the same church, had been in each other's weddings, had held each other through losses that neither of them talked about publicly. If Elam trusted anyone on earth, it was Ambrose. He met him in the parking lot of a gas station across town and showed him the pouch. Without explaining it first, Ambrose looked at it. His expression moved through several things in quick succession and then settled on something still and serious. "How long have you felt off?" he asked. "Months," Elam said. Ambrose closed his hand around the pouch and handed it back. "Do you know what this is?" "I think I do. Does she know you found it?" "No." Ambrose looked at him for a long moment. "You need to pray before you do anything. And you need to talk to someone who understands this more than we do." Elam nodded. "Bellamy," he said. He had heard about Bellamy for years, a former intercessor from a church across town, a woman who had spent decades praying over situations exactly like this. He had always treated those stories as background noise. Now he needed them. "I'll make the call," Ambrose said. Bellamy was 71 years old and had a voice, like warm gravel and eyes that had seen more than she ever spoke about. She came to a private meeting. The next evening, just her and Elam and Ambrose, and when Elam showed her the pouch and the jar and described the months of heaviness and the stalled ministry and the dreams, she did not look surprised. "This is not new," she said. "And the enemy is not creative. He just repeats what works." She asked Elam a few questions, not about the items, about his wife. "When did she change?" Bellamy asked. Elam thought carefully. 6 years ago, he said slowly, around the time we almost merged with Redemption Road Church. Bellamy nodded as if she had already known. "Fear is the door," she said. "It is almost always fear. Someone who loves you, who is terrified of losing something, goes looking for control. And the enemy is always on the other side of that door, ready to answer." "She thought she was protecting us," Elam said. He heard the grief in his own voice. "They always do," Bellamy said gently. Then she leaned forward. "But hear me, Pastor. What has been done in the dark can be undone by the light. That is not a metaphor. It is a spiritual law. The authority of Christ breaks every chain, including ones that were placed by the hands of someone who loves you. But you cannot do this with anger. You cannot do this with accusation. You will need to enter this with your heart broken open toward God and toward her. The prayer that breaks this has to come from love. Not performance, not strategy, love." Elam was quiet for a long time. "I still love her," he said. "I know," Bellamy said. "That is exactly why God showed you." He prayed for 3 more days before he spoke to Tegan. Not 3 days of planning what to say, 3 days of being in God's presence until his fear and his grief and his anger had passed through. Enough prayer that what remained was something quieter and truer, a grief with no edge to it, a love that had not stopped despite everything, and a clarity about who he was called to be in this moment. He chose a Sunday evening. The house was quiet. He asked Tegan to sit with him in the living room, and she came in with her tea and sat in the chair she always sat in, and he looked at her face. This face he had loved since he was 24 years old, and he said simply, "I found the pouch, Tegan." The change in her face was not what he expected. He had braced for denial, for anger, for performance. What he got was collapse. Her face did not harden. It crumpled, like a woman who has been holding something up by herself for years and has just been told she is allowed to put it down. She pressed her hands over her mouth. She did not say, "What pouch?" or "I don't know what you're talking about." She said nothing. She just breathed in short, broken increments behind her hands. And her eyes, wide and filling, stayed on his face. He moved from the couch to the floor in front of her chair. He got on his knees, not to be dramatic, but because it was the only posture that felt right. He took her hands gently from her mouth and held them. "I'm not here to condemn you," he said. His voice cracked, but he kept it steady. "I'm here because I love you and something has been stealing from us, and I need to understand what happened to you." She broke. She wept in a way that had no dignity in it, no control, no management. She wept from a place that sounded like it had been sealed for years and had just been cracked open. She wept and could not speak for a long time. And he knelt there on the floor and held her hands and let her. When she could finally speak, It came out in fragments. The merger, the fear, tyranny. Just one time? Elam, I only meant for it to be one time. The way one time had stretched and grown and deepened. And eventually she could not find her way back to where she had started. The way she had kept going to tyranny, even when she knew she should stop because somewhere, in those years she had lost confidence that God was paying attention to the small details, to her specific fears, to the things she needed but never said out loud. I never stopped believing in God, she said. I just stopped believing He was for me. Elam closed his eyes. I never stopped believing in God. I just stopped believing He was for me. He understood in that moment more about his wife's wound than he had in 8 years of marriage. And the understanding did not make him feel victimized. It made him grieve for her, for the years of fear she had carried alone, for the enemy who had come through a cracked door and stayed. You should have told me you were afraid, he said. You needed me to be strong, she whispered. I needed you to be honest, he said. Those are not the same thing. She pressed her forehead to his hands and wept again. What happened next was not a single dramatic moment. It was a season. Elam called Bellamy the next morning. Then he called Ambrose. Over the following 2 weeks, with Tegan's knowledge and participation, they gathered a small circle of trusted intercessors, Landry and Matthias among them, and they held 3 separate prayer sessions in the Pruitt home. They were not exorcism sessions. They were not theatrical. They were quiet, sustained, specific prayers spoken over every room of that house, over every object, over every memory, and every year. Bellamy led them, her voice low and certain, moving through the house the way a surgeon moves, precisely, without hurry. The pouch and the jar were removed from the home on the first night and destroyed. Tegan watched it happen. She did not flinch. On the second night, Tegan sat in a chair, in the center of the living room, and Bellamy and Landry prayed over her specifically, not over the things she had done, but over the fear that had opened the door. They prayed over her identity, over the wound that had convinced her God was distant, over the lie that had told her love needed to be managed and controlled to survive. Tegan wept through most of it. At one point she said, in a voice barely above a whisper, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Not to the people in the room, to God. Something shifted in the atmosphere of that room so noticeably that Matthias, who was standing in the doorway, later said it felt like a pressure he had not known was present suddenly releasing. He described it as the difference between a held breath and an exhale. The third night, Elam and Tegan prayed together, alone. They had not prayed together in years. Not really. They had performed prayer together, at church events and dinner tables and leadership meetings, but they had not knelt together in their own home and opened themselves to God as a couple, with nothing between them. They were on the floor of their bedroom. Elam prayed first. He prayed for his wife with a love that cost him something. He named her before God, not as someone who had wronged him, but as someone he had been called to cover, and he acknowledged that he had not always covered her. He had not always been a safe place for her fear. He had sometimes made strength a requirement for belonging in their marriage, and he repented of that in specific terms, with her sitting next to him, hearing every word. Then Tegan prayed. She prayed for a long time. She did not edit herself. She let everything come up and out. The fear that had started it, the shame of the years in between, the grief of what she had lost in herself during those years, the memory of who she used to be when she sang in the kitchen on Sunday mornings, and meant every word. I want to come home, she said near the end. Not to Elam, to God. I want to come back. I don't know if you still want me after what I've done, but I want to come home. The answer she felt? She would describe it later as warmth, not metaphorical warmth, a physical sensation spreading from the center of her chest outward, reaching her hands and her feet and the top of her head. She described it as the feeling of being found, of being looked for and found and held. She gripped Elam's hand on the floor of their bedroom and did not let go for a long time. The road after that was not simple or fast. Tegan ended her relationship with Tierney. She sought counseling, both pastoral and professional, for the fear and shame that had driven her choices. She took a temporary step back from her public ministry roles, not because she was asked to, but because she chose to. Because she understood that leadership required honesty, and she needed time to rebuild both. Elam entered his own counseling process. He had things to examine, about how he had built an environment where Tegan felt she had to be strong to be valued, about the ways his public life had swallowed his private one, about what it meant to pastor a congregation, well, when your own home had needed pastoring for years and you had not known. There were hard conversations between them, ones that lasted hours, ones where voices rose and old wounds came out of the walls. There was a period of 2 months where they saw a marriage counselor every week and left every session exhausted and sometimes angry and sometimes wrung out in the way that only happens when something real is being worked on. But they stayed, and slowly, the way slow things happen without fanfare, through accumulated small choices, they came back to each other. Not the versions they had been when things went wrong. Something newer and stranger and more honest. A marriage that had been broken all the way down and rebuilt from the actual foundation, rather than the surface. In March, 4 months after Elam found the pouch in the closet, Cornerstone Harvest Church held its annual spring revival. This one was different. Nobody on the planning team could explain exactly why. The worship ran longer than scheduled. Not in a disorganized way, but in the way that happens when the room does not want to stop. 3 people gave their lives to Christ before Elam even preached. When he stepped up to the pulpit, the atmosphere was so charged that he stood there for almost a full minute before he could find words, and the congregation sat in the silence without discomfort. He preached about hidden things. He did not tell his own story publicly. That would come later, carefully, with Tegan's full participation and blessing. But he preached about the things that hide in the walls of houses and in the spaces between people who love each other. He preached about fear that looks for shortcuts and finds chains instead. He preached about the mercy of God that reaches into the dark places and pulls up the buried things not to expose and destroy but to heal. When the altar call came, people moved before he finished the invitation. Matthias, standing at the side of the stage, counted 37. Not a symbolic number, just what it was. 37 people who came forward that evening and stood at the front with their faces broken open toward God. Landry was in the 3rd row and she was weeping. Good weeping. The kind that comes when something you have been praying about for months finally arrives. She thought of the night she had stopped on the sidewalk outside the parking garage with a warning pressing in her chest, and the prayer journal entry she had written. Something is wrong around the pastor. Lord, show me what to do with this. God had shown her. He had shown all of them. In April, Tegan returned to ministry. She did not return to her former role or former posture. She returned as a different woman, quieter in some ways, less polished, more honest. When she spoke in the women's ministry, she no longer spoke from the position of someone who had it together. She spoke from the position of someone who had been found. She did not share every detail publicly, but she shared enough. She said, I believed in God, but I stopped believing God believed in me. And that space, that gap between believing in Him and believing He was for me, that space is where the enemy moved in. Don't leave that space open. Take your fear to God directly. Don't take it somewhere else because somewhere else will take it. And what it gives you in return is not help. It is a longer chain. Women in the room wept, not because they all had pouch-in-the-closet stories, but because most of them understood the gap she was describing. The space between believing in God and believing God was for them, specifically in their specific fears and small panics and secret anxieties. That space was familiar. The testimony of what had been done in that space, and what God had done to close it, was more useful to them than any sermon point or ministry strategy. Elam sat in the back row during Tegan's talk and watched his wife speak from a place he had not seen her speak from in years. The manufactured polish was gone. What was left was something truer, something that had survived because it was real rather than constructed. He thought of the night on the closet floor. He thought of, you have not prayed for your home. He thought of how a single prayer, walked room by room through a house in the middle of the night, had uncovered a thing that was destroying him. How the act of praying, not strategically, not politically, but simply and physically, and with his hand on every doorframe, had moved him into a truth he had lived beside for years without seeing. He thought of Tegan's voice on the floor of their bedroom, I want to come home. And the warmth she had felt, spreading from her chest to her hands, and the grip of her fingers in his. He sat in the back of the room and watched his wife tell the truth to a room full of women and thought, something he would never preach, because it was too personal, too quiet, too precisely his own. God does not waste the breaking. He uses it all. Their story was not finished. Stories like this do not finish. They continue into the next day and the day after that, into the harder ordinary of two people, rebuilding trust not through a single moment but through 10,000 small choices made in the direction of honesty and grace. Some days were easier than others. There were mornings when Elam woke and felt the old shadow of the months he had been under, something he could not name, and had to deliberately choose to lay that grief down and not let it become a wall between them. There were nights when Tegan could not sleep because the shame came back, and she had learned by now not to handle that alone. She would wake Elam and they would pray together, not polished prayers, just honest ones. And in the honesty, the shame would lose some of its grip. They were not performing recovery. They were living it. And in the living of it, something was being built that could not be built any other way. Not in the early years of an easy marriage. Not in the middle years of public ministry success. Only here, in the rubble of a thing that had been broken all the way through. Could this particular foundation be laid? A marriage that had learned the cost of hiddenness. A home that had been prayed through room by room. A woman who had come back to herself. A man who had learned that the most important congregation he would ever shepherd was the one person asleep in his house. On a Thursday morning in April, Elam Pruitt stood in front of the bathroom mirror, knotting his tie. He reached for it himself. He knew he had reached for it himself. A blue tie, not his most elegant. A little worn at the knot from being chosen too often. And he put it on and looked at his reflection and said, quietly, the way you say something when there is no audience and no performance, and no reason for the words except that they are true. Thank you. 2 words, the shortest prayer, the truest one. From the bedroom, he heard Tegan's voice, rough with sleep. Elam, come back to bed for a few more minutes. He turned off the bathroom light and went. The Lord works righteousness and justice for all who are oppressed. Psalm 103:6.